Imagine yourself in a quiet stone chapel, lit only by flickering candles, the air heavy with incense. It is late at night, and outside, the medieval town sleeps. Yet within these walls, people are gathered, whispering prayers, not for salvation, but for answers. The Middle Ages were not merely an age of knights and castles. They were also an age of deep uncertainty. Crops could fail, disease could strike, wars could erupt without warning. In such a world, people longed to see beyond the present. They wanted to know what the future held. And so, they turned to oracles. In Europe, between the 12th and 15th centuries, countless strange methods of predicting the future emerged. Some were inherited from ancient Rome and Greece. Others from folk traditions passed quietly from grandmother to granddaughter. What makes these practices fascinating is not their accuracy, for they were often wrong, but the sheer seriousness with which they were pursued. One common practice was lot casting. A villager might throw sticks, bones, or even carefully mark stones upon the ground, reading their positions as if they spelled out divine instructions. This was often done at crossroads, believed to be places where the earthly and spiritual worlds touched. The diviner would kneel, murmuring words that blended prayers with pagan chants, while curious onlookers held their breath. But lot casting was only the beginning. Another widespread method was bibliomancy, seeking answers through books. In monasteries, it was not unusual for monks to consult the Bible in this way. The ritual was simple. Open a holy book at random, place a finger blindly on a verse, and read it aloud as an answer from God. To modern ears, this might sound like superstition, but to a frightened medieval peasant, or even to a learned cleric, it carried the weight of divine will. The oddity, of course, was that people did not limit themselves to sacred texts. In villages where few owned Bibles, peasants might use a psalter, a hymn book, or even a popular romance tale. Imagine trying to decide whether to marry by pointing to a random line in a tale of knights and dragons. Yet such was the desperation for guidance. Beyond books, there were natural signs. Farmers believed that the shape of clouds at sunrise could reveal whether the year would bring famine. Women sometimes observed the way a candle flame flickered in church to predict the outcome of childbirth. And in households where illness lingered, families might stare into bowls of water, searching for strange ripples that signaled either recovery or death. What is striking is that these practices existed in tension with the church. Officially, many forms of divination were condemned, yet in practice they persisted. Why? Because even priests and bishops, despite their warnings, lived in the same uncertain world. Some secretly consulted oracles themselves. Others tolerated these practices so long as they remained within a Christian framework, like using the Bible for bibliomancy. One of the most curious traditions was known as the ordeal. This was not mere superstition, but judicial practice sanctioned by law. If someone was accused of theft, for instance, they might be forced to plunge a hand into boiling water. The wound would then be inspected days later. If it healed cleanly, they were declared innocent, if not guilty. For contemporaries, this was not cruelty but divine judgment. God himself was believed to reveal the truth to the accused. It was thus a legal process and a terrifying oracle of fate. Meanwhile, among ordinary villagers, charms and rituals thrived. A mother might whisper a rhyme while tossing breadcrumbs into the fire, asking whether her sick child would live to see another day. A farmer might watch the flight of crows over a field, convinced that the pattern revealed the coming harvest. These may seem like quaint details, but to the medieval mind, the line between daily life and the supernatural was thin. Every flicker of wind, every roll of dice, every verse of scripture might carry hidden meaning. As you imagine these people, monks hunched over books, villagers kneeling at crossroads, farmers watching the sky, you begin to sense how overwhelming the desire for certainty was. The future was a mystery, and in a world with so little control, people reached for whatever tools they had, however strange. But here lies the unresolved question. Did these oracles truly comfort them, or did they only deepen the fear of the unknown? If Section 1 showed us the foundations of medieval divination, Section 2 is where we see the strange variety of methods and the way belief itself shaped daily life. The medieval world was full of rituals that blurred the line between religion and superstition, between the sacred and the forbidden. One of the most curious practices was dream interpretation. People in the Middle Ages believed that dreams were not random images of the mind, but messages from the divine. Monks kept careful records of their dreams, searching for symbols that might reveal the will of God. Entire manuals of dream interpretation circulated through Europe. A dream of bees might be taken as a sign of wealth to come. A dream of fire could mean war or destruction. But there was a strange duality. While dreams were sometimes considered prophetic, they were also suspected of being traps set by demons. A monk might wake in terror, wondering if the vision of light he saw was a message from God or a deception from hell. Then there were the astrologers. By the 13th century, astrology had seeped into nearly every level of European society. Kings employed astrologers to determine the best day to wage war or to crown a successor. Doctors used horoscopes to decide when to perform surgeries or when to let blood from a patient's veins. Even farmers checked the stars before planting. The heavens themselves were read as a great book, each constellation a letter written by God at the dawn of time. Today, we might think of horoscopes as a mild amusement in a newspaper column, but to medieval minds, astrology was deadly serious. Wars were delayed, marriages postponed, and treaties reconsidered because the stars had not aligned. Still stranger were the practices of scrying. In dimly lit rooms, diviners gazed into reflective surfaces, bowls of water, polished metal, even shards of crystal. The most famous example, of course, is the later legend of John Dee, advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, who claimed to peer into a crystal to converse with angels. But long before Dee, ordinary people in villages across Europe performed their own crude versions. A peasant girl might gaze into a bowl of water by candlelight on the night of a festival, hoping to see the face of her future husband. Others looked into mirrors or flames, waiting for shapes to emerge. Whether those shapes were truly divine or only the product of flickering shadows, the tension in those rooms must have been palpable. Another layer of medieval divination was found in omens and portents. The sudden flight of birds, the appearance of a comet, or even the sound of bells ringing at an unusual hour could be taken as warnings from heaven. Chroniclers wrote down these events with great seriousness. When Halley's Comet appeared in 1066, for example, it was widely considered a sign that great upheaval was coming. Indeed, shortly after, William the Conqueror invaded England. For those living at the time, the coincidence was not chance. It was proof that the cosmos itself declared fate. And yet, not all divination was grand or celestial. Many were humble rituals performed in kitchens, barns, and village squares. Casting lots with breadcrumbs to decide whether to travel. Placing shoes in particular patterns to ensure safe childbirth. Whispering charms into the ears of livestock to predict their health. These were not merely games. They were desperate acts of people trying to wrestle meaning from a chaotic world. The paradox of medieval divination was that people often held two contradictory beliefs at once. On the one hand, they trusted in the omnipotence of God. On the other, they believed that hidden signs could reveal his secrets if only they looked hard enough. For many, these practices were not a rejection of Christianity, but an extension of it. After all, was not the Bible itself full of dreams, visions, and prophecies? But the church could never fully control these impulses. Bishops might thunder against fortune-tellers, declaring them heretics, yet the people still sought them out. Inquisitors might burn manuals of astrology, but kings still consulted astrologers in secret. Even the most pious could not resist a pull of curiosity. What emerges from all this is a portrait of society, both deeply religious and deeply uncertain. A world where every flicker of a candle, every shadow in a dream, and every bird in the sky might be a message. And so the question lingers, was medieval divination a way of mastering fear, or did it only feed the endless hunger for certainty in an uncertain world? By the late Middle Ages, whispers of change drifted through Europe. The world that had once leaned so heavily on oracles and superstitions was beginning to transform. The same centuries that clung to charms and rituals also gave birth to universities, scholastic debate, and a growing hunger for systematic knowledge. And in that shift, many of the old methods of divination began to lose their hold. One key factor was the rise of centralized authority. Kings and princes increasingly sought order in their realms, and that meant cracking down on practices that could be seen as dangerous or destabilizing. Fortune tellers, soothsayers, and even village-wise women came under scrutiny. The church, too, redoubled its efforts, issuing edicts against astrology, sorcery, and magical rituals. The fear was not merely that these practices were sinful, but that they gave ordinary people a sense of power outside the approved order. At the same time, the Black Death in the 14th century revealed the limits of medieval divination. When plague swept through towns and villages, predictions failed, remedies proved useless, and prayers often went unanswered. People had looked to dreams, stars, and charms to prepare them for the future, but nothing foretold the scale of devastation. In the wake of such suffering, faith in oracles wavered. Some turned with greater fervor to the church, while others grew skeptical of all claims to foresee fate. And yet, astrology and divination did not vanish overnight. They adapted. By the 15th century, astrology had embedded itself within the framework of learned medicine. Doctors still consulted the heavens before performing treatments, but now they wrapped their predictions in the language of scholarship. Kings still employed astrologers, but the practice was cloaked in formality and charts rather than rustic omens. Even in the Renaissance, an age that prided itself on rediscovering reason in classical learning, belief in cosmic signs remained alive. More striking is how deeply these medieval practices echo in our own age. Consider the popularity of horoscopes today, the fascination with tarot cards, or the lingering habit of knocking on wood for luck. While modern people may laugh at the idea of a medieval peasant staring into a bowl of water to glimpse the future, the impulse remains familiar. We, too, long for glimpses beyond the present. We, too, look for patterns in chaos, meaning in coincidence, and hope in uncertainty. The oracles of medieval Europe remind us that human beings have always wrestled with the same questions. What is coming? How do we prepare for it? Are we helpless? Or can we influence fate? The answers have shifted across centuries, from bones cast at crossroads to algorithms predicting tomorrow's weather, but the longing itself has never changed. And so, as you imagine the last medieval scribe copying his book of dream interpretations, or the last village wise woman whispering charms in the fire, reflect on this. Are we truly any different today, or have we only exchanged one set of oracles for another? Picture yourself in a stone monastery in the 10th century. Outside, the sun is barely rising, the mist hangs low over the fields, and the air is filled with a faint smell of damp earth. Inside, silence dominates, broken only by the shuffle of sandals on cold floors and the low murmur of chants echoing through the chapel. This was a world without pocket watches, without wall clocks, without even a consistent sense of hours, as we know them today. For the monks, time was not something measured by machines, but something lived, prayed, and heard. The rhythm of their days was dictated by what they called the divine office, a cycle of prayers recited at fixed intervals, from the dead of night to the last moments before sleep. The challenge was simple but immense. How do you know when to pray if you have no clock? The earliest method was the most obvious, the sun itself. Monks rose at dawn for matins and lauds, prayed again at mid-morning for terce, at midday for sext, mid-afternoon for none, evening for vespers, and nightfall for compline. These prayers created a structure for the day, but the sun was not always visible. Clouds, storms, and long winter nights could easily obscure it, so other methods were devised. One solution was the water clock, or clepsydra. This simple device measured time to the slow dripping or flowing of water between containers. Monasteries sometimes kept large water clocks in central halls, their constant trickle serving as a reminder of passing hours. The Benedictine monk Cassiodorus, writing in the 6th century, praised such devices as a way of maintaining spiritual discipline. But water clocks were not always reliable. In freezing winters, the water might solidify. In hot summers, it evaporated too quickly. Another solution was candle clocks. A candle could be marked with lines, each one representing a portion an hour. As the wax melted, the time could be measured by the progress of the flame. Monks used these particularly at night, when darkness made it difficult to rely on shadows. The flicker of a candle in the chapel was more than light. It was a ticking hand, burning steadily toward the next prayer. Yet candles, too, had problems. Draught could burn them unevenly, and wax was expensive. For many monasteries, the true timekeepers were not devices, but people. The sacristan or timekeeper monk was responsible for rising in the middle of the night, sometimes by instinct, sometimes by rough calculation, and ringing the bells to summon the community for prayers. This role required a peculiar discipline, the ability to wake in darkness, listen for the faint changes in the night air, and decide when the appointed hour had arrived. Some monks became known for their uncanny accuracy, rising at nearly the same moment each night without fail. Others likely erred, calling the community to prayer too early or too late, leaving fellow monks bleary-eyed and quietly resentful. But resentment was rare compared to the importance of structure. For monks, time was not about efficiency. It was about devotion. Their lives were built on the belief that every hour belonged to God, and marking those hours with prayer was itself a form of discipline. To live without clocks was not a burden. It was an invitation to order the soul around the slow rhythms of nature and ritual. To modern minds, this way of keeping time may seem hopelessly imprecise. But in monasteries, precision mattered less than consistency. A prayer at dawn did not need to be at 6 a.m. sharp. It only needed to be at dawn, when light crept across the stones. Noon was when the sun stood highest, not when a mechanical dial declared it. The rhythm was tied to the world itself. And yet, one must ask, in a life where time was marked by the trickle of water, the flicker of candles, and the instincts of half-sleeping monks, did the passing of hours feel slower, more fluid, or did it feel just as urgent as ours, only cloaked in silence? If candles and water clocks offered practical solutions, the real heart of medieval timekeeping was not an object at all. It was the bell. By the 9th century, the bell tower had become the central timepiece of the monastery. The sound of bronze ringing across fields and valleys was more than just noise. It was a command of time itself. Monks no longer needed to stare at shadows or judge the dripping of water. When the bells sounded, the hour had arrived, whether it was dawn or midnight, whether they were ready or not. The word clock itself comes from the Latin clocca, meaning bell. In many ways, time in the Middle Ages was not something you saw on a dial. It was something you heard. Imagine living in a village nestled below a monastery. You did not own a watch. You did not even have a sundial. But when the monastery bell tolled, you knew it was time to rise, to work, or to pray. The monks' discipline shaped not only their own lives, but the rhythm of entire communities. The system that governed these bells was the canonical hours, drawn from the rule of Saint Benedict. Each prayer had its fixed place in the day. Matins, deep night, sometimes starting around 2 or 3 a.m. Lauds, dawn when light returned. Prime, the first hour after sunrise. Terce, mid-morning, the 3rd hour of daylight. Sext, midday, the 6th hour. None, mid-afternoon, the 9th hour. Vespers, evening prayer as the sun lowered. Compline, the final prayer before sleep. This cycle meant that monks woke, prayed, worked, studied, ate, and slept not by their own desires, but by the steady march of sacred hours. It was not only a schedule, but a worldview, the idea that life itself was divided into holy fragments, each consecrated to God. Of course, not every monastery had elaborate systems. In poorer or smaller houses, the sacristan might still be the one stumbling awake to strike the bell. In larger and wealthier abbeys, though, more creative methods emerged. Some used elaborate marked sundials on church walls, known as tide dials, to track the approximate times of prayer. Others employed hourglasses to measure sermons or tasks. But in every case, the bell remained the final authority. Over time, this practice extended beyond the cloister. Towns built their own bell towers, not only to summon the faithful, but to structure civic life. Markets opened at the ringing of bells. Curfews were set by them, and even punishments were announced with their toll. In this way, monks became the first keepers of public time. Their devotion to discipline and prayer bled into the lives of farmers, merchants, and travelers who heard their bells. But there's a subtle truth hidden here. Bells did not make life more precise. They made it more communal. To hear the bell was to be reminded that you were not alone in your labors or your prayers. Every sound linked you to dozens, sometimes hundreds, of others living in the same rhythm. The question remains, in a world where time was not marked by seconds ticking away, but by the sudden commanding strike of bronze, did people feel time as a constant presence, or only as a call that interrupted silence? By the 13th century, something new began to stir in Europe's monasteries and cathedral towns. the first experiments with mechanical clocks. They were crude at first, driven by weights and gears, often inaccurate and prone to failure. But they marked a profound shift. For the first time was no longer tied to shadows, water, wax, or instinct. It was being captured by iron and wood. The earliest mechanical clocks were usually installed in monasteries and churches, not private homes. Their purpose was not to help merchants schedule deliveries or travelers measure journeys, but to regulate prayer. Monks had long relied on bells, candles, and careful guesswork. Now, they had machines that could toll at fixed intervals without human error. The rhythm of prayer was still sacred, but it was becoming mechanical. Yet this did not mean precision immediately took over. These early clocks often lacked dials or hands. They simply rang bells at set times. To live in the 14th century was still to live in a world where hours stretched and bent, where midday meant the sun's height, not 12 o'clock on a dial. Still, the mechanical clock introduced a new idea, that time could be divided evenly, measured objectively, and controlled by human craft. For centuries, the monastery had been the keeper of time. Its bells structured the lives of both monks and the surrounding towns. But as mechanical clocks spread, time began to slip from sacred hands into civic and commercial ones. Town squares sprouted clock towers, their bells no longer calling only to prayer but to work, trade, and contracts. The shift was subtle but monumental. Time was becoming secular, and yet the legacy of monastic time-keeping remains. The very notion of dividing the day into hours, of living by a schedule, began in cloisters where monks counted prayers in the darkness. Even our modern obsession with productivity owes something to men in robes, rising at midnight to chant psalms by candlelight. When you think of those monks, fumbling with water clocks, watching candles drip, ringing bells in the mist, you may wonder, were their lives more free because time flowed with nature, or more bound because every hour belonged to ritual? And here lies the reflection. As we glance at our glowing phones to check the time, are we freer masters of clock, or simply servants of a different bell tower? Step into the bustling streets of ancient Rome. Marble columns gleam in the sun, merchants shout in crowded markets, and senators sweep past in crisp, white togas. Those togas, however, did not stay white on their own. Beneath the grandeur of Roman civilization lay an entire hidden economy of washing, bleaching, and scrubbing. And at its heart was one of the most overlooked trades of the empire, the fullers or professional launderers. In Rome, clothing was not disposable. A toga was a symbol of status, a mark of citizenship, and often an expensive garment to own. To appear in public with a stained or dingy toga was unthinkable for any respectable Roman. Clean, bright cloth carried social weight. And so, just as modern cities have dry cleaners on every corner, ancient Rome had phalonici, workshops dedicated to laundering. The methods, though, were far removed from what we imagine as clean. Fullers did not rely on soap in the modern sense. Instead, they turned to a resource both abundant and free, human urine. Collected in jars placed on street corners, urine was gathered and sold to fullers, who prized it for its ammonia content. When mixed with water, it became a powerful cleaning agent, capable of loosening dirt, grease, and even odors from fabric. Picture phallonica in action. Large stone vats filled with liquid, some with water, others with a pungent mix of water and urine, lined the workshop. Slaves or workers would step into these vats and stomp on the clothing with their bare feet, rhythmically pressing the fabric underfoot. To walk by one of these laundries was to hear the steady slap of wet cloth, the hiss of conversation, and, unmistakably, the acrid smell of ammonia rising into the air. After this first stage of cleaning, garments were rinsed in fresh water, then brushed with clay powders to absorb oils and brighten color. Finally, they were hung out to dry in courtyards or rooftops, bleaching under the Mediterranean sun. Some garments were pressed between heavy wooden boards or polished with smooth stones to restore a crisp finish. The work was grueling. Fullers often labored from dawn to dusk, their skin raw from the chemicals, their lungs filled with the sour scent of ammonia. Yet the profession was indispensable. Wealthy Romans might sneer at the smell of the phallonica, but they depended on it. Even emperors relied on these humble workshops to keep their ceremonial robes immaculate. The fuller's trade was so important that it was regulated by law. Inscriptions survive that describe guilds of fullers, known as a collegium fullonum, who organized themselves much like modern trade associations. They had their own rituals, meeting places, and even honored patron gods, including Minerva, the goddess of craft and industry. What is perhaps most striking is how normal this all seemed to Romans. To them, the use of urine was not disgusting, but practical, even ingenious. Just as we might view soap powder as ordinary, they saw value in something freely available on every street corner. But here's the curiosity that lingers. Did the citizens walking past those vats ever wonder, as the acrid smell filled the air, whether the gleaming togas of Rome's senators were worth the stench and sweat that made them so? If the streets of Rome were filled with marble, markets, and monuments, they were also filled with laundry. Fulonicae were as common in Roman cities as taverns or bathhouses, and their presence tells us something profound about daily life. Clothing maintenance was an industry, not a household chore. The guilds of fullers, the collegium fullonum, occupied a unique place in Roman society. Unlike senators or equestrians, fullers did not command respect through wealth or political power. Their trade was considered humble, even dirty, and yet they wielded influence through sheer necessity. Every toga, every tunic, every cloak passed through their hands sooner or later. Guilds provided organization and protection for this trade. Members shared resources, regulated prices, and maintained rituals to honor their craft. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii reveals Fulonicae with elaborate mosaics, shrines, and inscriptions praising the dignity of profession. One famous painting shows fullers working in vats, pressing fabric with their feet, while others hang garments on lines above them. Even amid the smell and sweat, there was pride in the skill. But not all Romans viewed the fullers with admiration. Satirists mocked the profession, writing of the stink that clung to their clothes and hair. The poet Martial, never one to miss an insult, referred to the smell of a fuller as a badge of dishonor. And yet, when aristocrats needed their robes brightened for public ceremonies, they had no choice but to visit the same men they scorned. The role of fullers also extended into the broader economy. Urine, their essential cleaning agent, became so valuable that emperors taxed it. The most famous case was Emperor Vespasian in the 1st century CE. When criticized for levying a tax on urine collected from public latrines, he reportedly held a coin to his nose and remarked, "Pecunia non olet." Money does not stink. The phrase became a proverb, reminding Romans that profit could come from even the foulest sources. Beyond urine, the fullers relied on other supplies. Clay powders such as fuller's earth were mined and shipped across the empire. Ash from wood and volcanic stone served as abrasives. Even the construction of vats and drainage systems reveals an impressive investment in infrastructure. A well-run Fullonica was not just a shop, it was an industrial hub. For workers, the job was exhausting. Stomping garments in vats required stamina and rhythm, often performed for hours on end. Rinsing and drying demanded space and coordination. In larger workshops, dozens of slaves or laborers might be employed at once, their lives bound to the endless cycle of scrubbing and bleaching. Their toil was largely invisible, hidden behind the elegance of clean garments. And yet, their work shaped how Rome presented itself. The whiteness of a senator's toga was not simply a matter of personal vanity. It was a public statement of power, purity, and order. A stained toga could shame a man before his peers. In that sense, fullers were guardians of Roman image. Their dirty hands ensured that others could appear spotless. This paradox runs through Roman laundry. It was both despised and indispensable, lowly in status but high in necessity. And it raises the question, did the men who mocked the stench of Fullonica ever realize that their authority itself was polished in those same vats? In ancient Rome, clothing was never just fabric. A bright white toga could proclaim citizenship, honor, and even moral virtue. A dull or stained garment, by contrast, suggested laziness, poverty, or shame. This gave fullers an unusual power. They were not simply cleaning clothes, but upholding the social fabric itself. The association of whiteness with purity was deeply rooted. Senators wore dazzling white togas, the toga candida, from which we get the word candidate. These garments were not just washed but polished, whitened with chalk or fuller's earth until they almost glowed. To stand in the fore with such a toga was to embody Roman ideals of clarity, order, and dignity. Behind that gleam, however, were vats of urine, sore-footed workers, and long hours of stomping and rinsing. The paradox of Roman cleanliness extended to the baths. Romans bathed frequently, scrubbing their bodies with oils and scraping themselves with strigils. Clean clothes completed this ritual of respectability. To be unwashed, either in body or garment, was to slip outside the boundaries of Roman identity. The Phalanaka, then, was more than a workshop. It was a cultural necessity, reinforcing the values of the empire one garment at a time. Yet as the empire weakened, so too did its systems of daily life. The grand cities at once rang with the sound of merchants, and bathers began to empty. Urban infrastructure crumbled, aqueducts fell into disrepair, and with them the thriving industries that depended on water supply. Phalanaki among them. In the ruins of Pompeii, buried under volcanic ash, archaeologists discovered preserved Phalanaki, frozen mid-task. Vats, basins, drying racks, and mosaics depicting the trade. These silent workshops stand as ghostly reminders of a vanished industry. When Rome's political order collapsed, the intricate networks of trade that supplied clay powders, oils, and fine fabrics collapsed too. Local washing practices survived, of course, but the professional guilds of fullers lost their central place. The elaborate systems of laundering that once defined Roman public life faded into fragments, remembered only in ruins and inscriptions. What is remarkable is how long their shadow lingered. The techniques of bleaching, pressing, and finishing garments carried into medieval Europe, though in simpler forms. The association between clean garments and moral worth remained strong, and the profession of laundering never disappeared entirely. But the scale and sophistication of Rome's Phalanaki, tied to the empire's vast resources, would not be matched again for centuries. Standing before the remains of a Roman laundry today, it is difficult not to reflect on the irony. Rome prided itself on its grandeur, its monuments, its armies, its emperors. Yet its elegance depended on tradesmen working barefoot in vats of urine, stomping out stains for hours at a time. Civilization, in all its glory, was sustained by the most humble and unglamorous of labors. And so the question lingers. When we think of Rome's greatness, do we forget that its spotless togas, its very image of order, came from the sweat of those whose names history rarely remembers? Imagine a village in the 14th century. The sun has set, candles gutter in cottages, and darkness stretches across fields and forests. With no streetlights, no glowing screens, and little reason to stay awake, people retire early. Families gather on straw mattresses, pulling woolen blankets close against the chill. Sleep comes quickly, and the house grows silent. But what is remarkable is not that they slept, it is how they slept. In the Middle Ages, the typical night was divided into two distinct phases: first sleep and second sleep. This pattern appears again and again in diaries, medical texts, and even literature. People would drift off soon after nightfall, sleeping deeply for several hours. Then, in the middle of the night, they would wake. This waking period, lasting 1 to 2 hours, was not seen as insomnia or a problem. It was a natural part of life. People called it the watch or the waking. They used it for quiet tasks, tending the fire, checking on animals, mending clothing, even visiting neighbors. Some prayed or read, believing the midnight hour to be especially suited for reflection. Others shared whispered conversations or intimacy with their spouses. Then, as the night deepened, they would return to bed for their second sleep, waking again at dawn. Historians have found countless references to this divided night. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, characters speak of rising from their first sleep. Medical treatises of the period recommend that the hours between sleeps were the best time for study, prayer, or conception. Court records even mention crimes committed in these middle hours, proof that not everyone used the time for peaceful reflection. The rhythm made sense in a world without artificial light. Humans are naturally sensitive to the cycles of dark and light. Studies show that, left to natural conditions, people often fall into the same segmented pattern of sleep, waking calmly in the middle of the night without distress. What feels like a disorder to us today was, for them, a normal rhythm of existence. This pattern shaped the very texture of medieval nights. Imagine a village where, around midnight, faint glows of candles and hearths flickered in scattered houses, where quiet footsteps crossed courtyards, where prayers murmured in the silence, and where the world felt suspended between sleep and waking. But this way of living raises a curious question. Did people in the Middle Ages, with their first and second sleeps, experience rest more deeply than we do? Or did the night's division make them more restless, always half aware of the dark around them? The watch, as medieval people called it, was not wasted time. For many, it was the most useful part of the night. Unlike the blur of daytime labor, these quiet hours carried a different rhythm, slow, hushed, and strangely productive. In peasant households, the waking period often began with tending the fire. Hearths were rarely left to burn freely through the night. Wood was precious, and fires were carefully banked to keep coals smoldering until morning. Upon waking from first sleep, someone in the household would stir the embers, adding kindling or larger logs to ensure warmth for the second half of the night. Without this ritual, a family might wake to bitter cold. Others turned to small domestic tasks. Women often used the time for mending clothing or spinning thread by lamplight. Men might check on livestock, listening for the sound of wolves or thieves in the darkness. In villages, it was not unusual for neighbors to knock softly at one another's doors, sharing conversation, or even ale during these middle hours. The night was not empty. It was alive with faint, scattered activity. There was also a strong spiritual dimension. Monastic communities, bound to the cycle of prayer, deliberately rose at midnight for matins, their chants echoing in cold stone chapels. Ordinary people, influenced by this rhythm, sometimes mirrored at home. Prayer manuals advise that the hours between sleeps were the most blessed, a time when the soul was most open to God. Husbands and wives knelt together, whispering psalms or reciting rosaries. For some, it was a chance to confess anxieties and seek divine reassurance. Medical texts of the time even gave practical advice for this waking period. Physicians wrote that it was the best time for study, since the mind was refreshed from first sleep. Others claimed it was the ideal time for intimacy, arguing that the body was more relaxed and receptive after rest. Records from court cases reveal that crimes from theft to violence sometimes occurred in these hours, when streets were half empty but not entirely still. The language of the era reflects how deeply this rhythm was embedded. Phrases like "after my first sleep" or "until second sleep" appear naturally in diaries, poems, and legal testimony. For them, the night was not a single block of unconsciousness, but a structured landscape with its own phases and expectations. What is striking is how communal this experience could be. Imagine a village where, around midnight, faint lights appeared in scattered windows, where voices murmured in the stillness, where dogs barked in response to footsteps. The night was not a dead space, but a second kind of day, smaller, slower, and more intimate. And so we are left with the question: did medieval people feel the night as an extension of life, filled with hidden opportunities? Or did its wakefulness remind them that even in rest, they were never far from the demands of survival? By the 17th century, something curious began to happen. The language of first sleep and second sleep faded from written records. The divided night, so common in the Middle Ages, was slipping away. What changed? The answer lies in the arrival of artificial light. With the spread of cheap candles, oil lamps, and eventually gas lighting, people no longer surrendered to darkness at sundown. Cities glowed longer into the night. Shops stayed open later. Households lingered over meals and conversations. Instead of drifting into first sleep soon after dusk, families stayed awake for hours. Bedtime crept later, until the two-sleep rhythm no longer fit. Another force was the Industrial Revolution. Factories demanded punctuality, not fluid rhythms of waking and resting. Clocks dictated when workers rose, ate, and slept. Employers had no patience for men and women who woke in the middle of the night and napped until dawn. Sleep was compressed into a single block, disciplined by the tick of gears and the shriek of whistles. Yet even as the practice vanished, traces of it remained. Rural communities in Europe continued to speak of first and second sleeps into the 18th and even 19th centuries. Some anthropologists studying non-industrial societies have found similar patterns, suggesting that this divided sleep may be a natural rhythm of the human body when freed from electric light. Modern sleep studies, conducted in laboratories with controlled darkness, have shown that people often revert to segmented sleep patterns after several weeks, waking calmly in the middle of the night, just as medieval villagers did. What was lost with the second sleep was not merely a pattern of rest, but a way of relating to the night. Those quiet hours between sleeps created space. Space for prayer, for intimacy, for reflection, for tasks too small or private for the bustle of daytime. In today's world, midnight is more likely filled with glowing screens and humming machines than with candlelight and whispered songs. And so, as we hurry toward efficiency and compress our nights into seamless blocks, we might ask, was a medieval habit of dividing sleep into two acts of rest a sign of disorder? Or was it, in fact, a gentler, more human way of living with the dark? Imagine standing in a muddy field at harvest time, stacking bundles of wheat under a pale autumn sun. You know that not all of it belongs to you. Before you can feed your family or trade with neighbors, you must set aside a portion for the tax collector. This was a reality of life for centuries across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Ordinary people paid their dues not in money, but in the goods they grew, raised, or caught. In the Roman Empire, taxes in kind were common. A farmer might deliver sacks of grain to a local granary, where officials measured and recorded every bushel. These supplies fed armies, supported cities, and filled the warehouses that kept the empire alive. In provinces near the sea, fishermen owed catches of fish. In mountainous regions, shepherds delivered wool or hides. To the state, all it was wealth. As essential as coins, medieval kingdoms continued the practice. In France, peasants might owe a portion of their harvest to both the crown and the local lord. In Scandinavia, taxes could be paid in dried fish, a valuable commodity that traveled far across trade routes. In Eastern Europe, salt was so precious that entire systems of taxation were built around it. The Polish salt tax, for instance, enriched kings and fueled conflict for centuries. The system was not limited to food. In some regions, peasants owed labor itself. Days spent repairing roads, building fortifications, or harvesting crops for their lord. This was known as corvée labor, and while it did not empty barns or granaries, it consumed time and strength. For the poor, it was often the most dreaded form of tax. What is striking is how deeply these taxes penetrated into daily survival. A family might spend all summer tending fields, only to hand over a third of their grain at harvest. A fisherman might rise before dawn, fight rough waters, and deliver his best catch not to his household, but to a tax official. Even salt, so ordinary today, was once guarded like treasure, its taxation sparking unrest and shaping economies. Records show the resentment these systems caused. In England, complaints of oppressive dues echo through village accounts. In Japan, peasants rose in rebellion against burdensome rice taxes. And yet, there was little choice. To live under a kingdom or empire was to be part of a chain of tribute, where survival was always measured not only by weather and harvest, but by the demands of rulers. Still, not all taxes were viewed with despair. Some communities treated them as rituals of belonging. Delivering grain to the local granary or fish to the town market was also a way of confirming one's place in the social order. It was a burden, but also a duty. In return, rulers promised protection, armies to defend against raids, justice to settle disputes, or roads to connect markets. Whether those promises were fulfilled was another matter. And so the image remains vivid. A peasant with bent back carrying sacks of wheat, a fisherman with nets heavy not for his own household, but for the king, a salt miner whose labor filled royal treasuries. Which leaves us with a question. Did these taxes truly bind society together, or did they quietly fuel the discontent that would, time and again, boil over into revolt? If paying taxes in grain or fish was a burden, collecting them was a profession all its own. Across the ancient and medieval world, entire bureaucracies existed to ensure that goods flowed from peasants' hands into royal treasuries. In Rome, officials known as publicani oversaw the collection of taxes. Farmers hauled their grain to warehouses, where clerks waited, marked tallies on wax tablets, and stored the harvest for redistribution. These granaries, massive, stone-built structures, became symbols of imperial power. Some were so vast that they could feed legions of soldiers for months. For a farmer standing before those walls, handing over part of his livelihood, the sheer scale of the state must have felt overwhelming. In medieval Europe, the process was often less orderly but no less intimidating. Local lords or royal agents arrived at harvest time, sometimes accompanied by armed guards. They measured out dues with wooden bushels or tallied livestock one by one. The goods were then transported to castles, monasteries, or town markets, where they sustained both rulers and the church. The role of the tax collector was not an enviable one. They were hated by those they taxed, yet relied upon by kings. To enforce compliance, collectors wielded considerable authority. A farmer who tried to hide part of his harvest might find his property seized, or worse, his family punished. Stories of abuse are common. Officials inflating quotas, demanding bribes, or pocketing portions of the goods. Resentment simmered in villages, where collectors were seen less as servants of the crown than as predators feeding off the poor. Salt, in particular, was a flashpoint. In France, the gabelle, a royal tax on salt, became one of the most hated levies of the late Middle Ages. Every household needed salt to preserve food, yet its price was artificially inflated by taxation. Smugglers, known as faux-sonneurs, risked prison or death to move untaxed salt across borders. The resentment ran so deep that centuries later, anger over the salt tax fueled revolutionary fervor in 18th century France. Fish, too, carried unique tensions. In coastal regions, fishermen often owed a portion of their catch to the crown or the church. For inland monasteries, salted or dried fish was a staple food, especially during long periods of fasting. Peasants grumbled that their best catches disappeared into monastery cellars while their own families ate scraps. But refusal was dangerous. A fisherman caught withholding his tithe could be fined heavily or lose access to waters altogether. Grain remained the most fundamental tax. Stored in great barns and granaries, it fed not only armies but entire cities. In times of scarcity, rulers could redistribute supplies to prevent famine, or withhold them to punish rebellious regions. For ordinary people, the sight of full granaries during a hungry winter was a bitter reminder of who controlled survival. These systems reveal a double truth. Taxation in kind sustained kingdoms, but it also deepened divisions. The goods that passed from peasants to rulers were tangible: bread, fish, salt, things essential to life itself. To surrender them was not merely to pay money, but to give up nourishment. And so the lingering question is this: when a family watched their best harvest vanish into a lord's storehouse, did they see it as a price of order, or as proof that the scales of survival were forever tilted against them? As centuries passed, the weight of taxes in kind shaped not only daily life, but the very course of history. The pattern was familiar. Rulers demanded goods, collectors enforced quotas, resentment grew, and eventually rebellion followed. In medieval France, fury over salt and grain dues simmered for generations. Villages that felt crushed by obligations occasionally rose in open revolt, refusing to pay or attacking collectors. These uprisings were rarely successful. The crown's forces were swift to respond, but they left scars in local memory. The hatred of the gabelle, the salt tax, endured so long that it became one of the sparks of the French Revolution nearly 500 years after its introduction. In Russia, peasants faced heavy grain obligations well into the Tsarist period. Famine years often turned deadly, not because the harvest completely failed, but because so much it was seized to supply cities and armies. Rebellions, from small peasant risings to larger Cossack revolts, frequently carried the same demand: relief from impossible dues. In Asia, rice played the role that grain did in Europe. The Japanese Kakadaka system measured land not by size, but by how much rice it could yield, and that rice was a tax. Farmers watched their best harvest carried off to support samurai lords and shoguns. As in Europe, resistance sometimes flared, but the system was so deeply embedded in governance that it endured for centuries. And yet, taxes in kind were not only instruments of oppression, they were also lifelines of states. Without them, armies could not march, cities could not eat, and rulers could not govern. Grain granaries kept Rome's legions fed. Salt dues built roads and fortifications in France. Fish tides filled monastery stores that sustained both monks and the poor during fasting seasons. For rulers, these goods were the very arteries of power. But for ordinary people, the experience was different. To hand over a sack of grain was to feel hunger looming closer. To surrender salt was to risk food spoiling in winter. To watch fish taken from nets was to lose the taste of one's own labor. These were not abstract coins, they were survival itself. The legacy of such systems lingers today. Modern taxation is measured in money, not sacks of wheat, yet echoes remain. When governments take income directly from wages, or when essential goods carry heavy taxes, the old tensions stir again. The debate is still the same. How much should the state demand, and what do the people truly receive in return? And so the reflection endures. Were taxes and salt, fish, and grain the glue that held kingdoms together, or the silent burden that ensured they would one day fall apart? Picture the early morning in a medieval village. Mist clings to the riverbanks, roosters crow, and farmers trudge along dirt paths carrying sacks of grain. Their destination is the heart of the community's survival. The mill, whether perched by a stream, powered by a turning wheel, or standing on a hill with sails catching wind, the mill was more than a building. It was a lifeline. At its center stood the mill worker, often overlooked, often resented, yet indispensable. His job was deceptively simple. Take the villagers' grain and grind it into flour. But the process was anything but easy. The day began before sunrise. The mill worker inspected the great millstones, massive discs of granite or basalt that had to be sharpened and aligned with care. Too close, and they scorched the grain too far, and the flour came out coarse and useless. A craftsman's eye and hand were essential. He checked the gears, wooden cogs, and the water channels or sails that powered the wheel. A broken tooth in a gear or a jam in the chute could halt production for days. As villagers arrived, the real grind began. Sacks of barley, rye, or wheat were hauled inside and hoisted up by pulleys. Grain was poured into hoppers, slowly fed between the stones with a steady clatter. The air filled with dust so fine it coated every surface. The worker's hair, his clothes, his lungs. To breathe in a mill was to swallow the very dust of life. Noise filled the building. The creak of timbers, the splash of water, the groan of turning wheels, the relentless crunch of stone on stone. Conversation was nearly impossible. The worker communicated with gestures, nodding at farmers or pointing to piles of flour ready to be bagged. For each sack of grain, the miller kept a portion, his multure, the fee for his labor, and the upkeep of the mill. This practice was ancient and universal, but it made the mill worker deeply unpopular. Villagers grumbled that millers took more than their share, cheating by weighing unfairly or skimming off extra flour. The stereotype of the greedy miller appears again and again in medieval tales and jokes. And yet, no one could avoid him. Without the mill, there was no bread. The work itself was exhausting. Hauling sacks, adjusting stones, cleaning mechanisms, and breathing flour dust left the worker weary and ill. The constant rumble of the mill became a kind of endless background to his life. The sound of survival grinding on and on. And yet, the mill was also a place of community. Farmers lingered while waiting for their grain, exchanging news and gossip. Children played near the wheel, watching water or wind turn with a power that seemed almost magical. The mill worker stood at the center of this daily rhythm, half craftsman, half gatekeeper of life itself. But as you imagine his dust-caked hands and weary eyes, you might wonder, did he see himself as a servant of the community, or as a man trapped beneath the very stones he turned each day? If the mill worker kept the bread of the village flowing, he also carried a burden heavier than sacks of grain: distrust. For centuries, millers were among the most disliked figures in rural life. Why? Because the mill was a place of dependency. Farmers had no choice but to bring their grain. Bread was a staple of survival, and hand-grinding enough flour at home was nearly impossible for large families. The lord of the manor often controlled the mill, making it illegal for peasants to grind their own grain outside of it. This monopoly meant that villagers were compelled to use the mill, paying fees whether they liked it or not. And so suspicion flourished. Tales circulated of millers who skimmed grain, slipping a little extra from each sack into their own stores. Others were accused of cheating the scales, weighing flour against stones or tampered weights. Some claim that millers dampened flour with water to increase its weight or mixed husks back into the grind. Whether these charges were true or exaggerated hardly mattered. They fed the enduring stereotype of the greedy, dishonest miller. This image seeped into culture, in stories and poems. Millers were often portrayed as tricksters or villains. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales includes a miller's tale, where the character is bawdy and deceitful. In village humor, the miller became a symbol of cunning self-interest, a man who profited from the labor of others. And yet, the mill itself was a place of community gathering. Farmers queued with their grain, chatting while they waited for their turn. News and gossip flowed through the mill as steadily as the water wheel turned. Some came not only to grind but to socialize, turning the mill into a kind of unofficial meeting hall. Children, too, found fascination there. The turning wheel, the rushing water, the rhythmic creak of gears, all gave the mill an air of mystery. For many, it was their first encounter with technology larger than themselves. The mill was not just a workplace. It was one of the few places in the countryside where human effort and natural force combined in visible, audible harmony. For the mill worker, this dual role, gatekeeper and suspect, created a precarious position. He relied on the trust of the community, yet his livelihood depended on taking a portion of their harvest. He was both essential and resented, indispensable and distrusted. The mill's economic power also gave it symbolic weight. The steady grinding of stones reminded villagers that survival was a collective effort, bound to forces beyond any one person. The river's flow, the wind's strength, the Lord's rules, and the miller's hands. And so we return to the central paradox. Did the miller stand at the heart of the community as its servant, or at its edge as a figure of suspicion and quiet resentment? The mill was more than a workplace. It was a symbol of authority. In many villages, the lord of the manor owned the mill outright. Peasants were legally bound to use it, forbidden to grind their grain by hand with querns. This banal right, as it was called in parts of Europe, ensured that every sack of grain passed through the mill, and that the lord and his miller received their cut. For villagers, it was a daily reminder that survival itself was entangled with power. In towns and cities, mills reached an even greater scale. Some stood on rivers with multiple wheels turning side by side, grinding vast quantities of grain to feed urban populations. Others rose as windmills on open plains, their sails creaking against the horizon. These machines were marvels of their age, precursors to industrial technology, harnessing nature's forces with timber and stone. At the heart of each stood the mill worker, tending the mechanisms, watching for breakdowns, and guiding the endless flow of grain. Life inside the mill was harsh. Dust choked the air, coating lungs and skin. The roar of grinding stones made silence rare. Mill workers lived with constant danger. Stones could crack, gears could break, wheels could splinter. A single accident could maim or kill. Yet their labor rarely brought wealth. The fees they collected were often owed to the lord or monastery, leaving the worker himself with little more than survival. Still, the mill carried a kind of dignity. To manage such a machine required skill and vigilance. A careless worker could ruin flour, jam the gears, or waste grain. And in a world where bread was life, mistakes carried heavy consequences. The mill worker was not a craftsman of beauty like a stonemason or a goldsmith, but he was a craftsman of necessity. His work turned harvest into sustenance, toil into nourishment. As centuries passed, mills became symbols of continuity. Villages rose and fell, lords died and were replaced, but the wheel kept turning, grinding grain as it always had. Even into the early modern period, the sight of a mill, sails against the sky, wheels turning in streams, remained a familiar anchor in the landscape. Yet the memory of the miller lingered in folklore as a man both needed and distrusted. Someone caught between the stones of service and suspicion. He was the one who kept the bread flowing, but also the one villagers grumbled about in hushed tones. Perhaps that was inevitable. To stand at the crossroads of necessity and profit is to invite both dependence and resentment. And so the reflection remains. Was the mill worker the quiet hero who fed his community, or the shadowed figure who profited from their hunger? Walk into a medieval garden, and you would almost certainly see rows of cabbage, thick, Green leaves curling into tight heads, growing low to the soil, sturdy against wind and cold. For peasants and nobles alike, cabbage was not just a staple food. It was considered a healer, a plant of almost miraculous properties. The belief was ancient. Roman writers like Cato the Elder praised cabbage as a medicine that could cure nearly every ailment. He claimed it could prevent drunkenness if eaten before drinking, heal wounds when applied as a poultice, and soothe internal disorders when boiled. These ideas filtered into the medieval world, where classical texts were revered alongside folk wisdom. By the Middle Ages, cabbage was firmly entrenched in the medical imagination. Monastic gardens cultivated cabbage with care, not only for the kitchen but for the infirmary. Medieval medical manuals recommended cabbage for fevers, stomach troubles, headaches, and even melancholy. Physicians trained in the humoral theory of medicine saw cabbage as cooling and drying, balancing the excessive bodily humors thought to cause disease. Too much blood? Too much phlegm? Cabbage could help. But the remedies went far beyond theory. A mother might press boiled cabbage leaves her child's chest to ease a cough. A farmer might rub raw cabbage on a wound to draw out infection. In towns, apothecaries sold cabbage preparations alongside herbs like sage and rosemary. Cabbage juice was sometimes mixed with honey for sore throats, or with vinegar for headaches. It was also tied to superstition. Some believed placing cabbage leaves under a pillow could ward off evil spirits. Others thought carrying a cabbage sprout in a pocket would protect against illness. In villages where charms and cures blended freely, cabbage was more than food. It was a shield against the unseen dangers of daily life. Beyond medicine, cabbage was survival itself. Cheap, hearty, and filling, it appeared on nearly every table. Peasants boiled it into soups with onions and barley. Nobles ate it stewed with spices. In winter, when fresh food was scarce, cabbages stored in cellars kept hunger at bay. Its reputation as a cure-all may have been as much about its reliability as its supposed powers. Imagine, then, the sight of medieval kitchens, great pots simmering with cabbage, its pungent scent filling the air. Imagine infirmaries where cabbage poultices were applied to the sick, or fields where women plucked leaves believing they carried healing in their hands. And so the question lingers, did people believe in cabbage because it truly healed them, or because they needed to believe that something so ordinary could hold extraordinary power? To understand the place of cabbage in medieval medicine, you have to imagine a world without pharmacies, without antibiotics, without even the simplest aspirin. For most people, healing meant turning to what grew in the soil. And among all those plants, cabbage was king. Physicians working within the humoral system believed that all illnesses came from imbalances of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Food and medicine were meant to restore harmony. Cabbage, considered cold and dry, was said to counter fevers and inflammation. When boiled with vinegar, it was prescribed for digestive troubles. When eaten raw, it was thought to sharpen the mind and cure drunkenness, advice that came directly from Roman texts. The uses were astonishingly varied. Poultices of boiled leaves were bound to wounds, swellings, or sore joints. Cabbage juice was mixed with wine and drunk to treat coughs and even jaundice. Pickled cabbage, preserved in brine, was considered especially good for winter ailments, cleansing the stomach when fresh greens were scarce. Some healers claimed that placing cabbage leaves on the forehead could ease headaches, while others swore it could draw out poison from bites. In rural villages, where trained physicians were rare and expensive, such remedies were part of everyday knowledge. Mothers passed them to daughters, neighbors shared recipes, and monks recorded them in herbals. In households with no access to exotic spices or rare ingredients, cabbage was practical. You grew it, you ate it, and you healed with it. But cabbage was not only medicine. It carried a touch of ritual. In some traditions, people placed cabbage leaves on the hearth as protection against illness. Others burned dried cabbage stalks to drive away bad luck. Folklore mingled with medicine, turned the plant into a symbol of resilience and protection. Its role in diet reinforced this trust. A family might eat cabbage soup daily in winter, its strong smell filling the cottage. If illness struck, the same cabbage appeared again as a cure. Food and medicine were not separate categories. They were the same thing. The act of eating cabbage itself was seen as part of staying healthy. Cabbage also shaped social identity. Wealthy households with access to spices and meats sometimes looked down on cabbage as peasant food, yet even nobles could not avoid it. Recipes survive from aristocratic kitchens that include cabbage stew with expensive seasonings, a way of transforming the humble leaf into something refined. The fact that cabbage crossed class lines only deepened its association with universality. And so, in cottage, monastery, and manor alike, cabbage endured. It was a food, a cure, a charm, and a comfort. Its reputation as a universal remedy was not simply a belief in magic. It was the product of necessity, ritual, and daily survival. Still, one must ask, did cabbage truly heal, or did its power lie in the faith people placed in it, turning an ordinary plant into a vessel for hope? By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the reputation of cabbage began to shift. As medical learning expanded, physicians slowly moved away from blanket remedies and toward more specialized treatments. Exotic herbs and imported spices arrived through trade routes, offering new options for healing. Yet cabbage did not disappear. It adapted, slipping gradually from the medicine chest into the kitchen pot. Medical writers still praised it, but with more caution. Some warned that cabbage could cause flatulence or heaviness if eaten in excess. Others noted that while it might ease digestion for one patient, it could worsen it for another, depending on their humoral balance. What had once been hailed as a near-universal cure was now treated as a common ingredient with limited but real benefits. Meanwhile, its role as food only deepened. In peasant households, cabbage was a survival crop. It grew in poor soil, withstood cold weather, and could be stored through the winter. Fermented into sauerkraut in German-speaking lands, it became a source of vitamins that warded off scurvy long before anyone understood the science behind it. In Eastern Europe, stews of cabbage and meat became staples that endure today. In this way, cabbage's reputation as a healer never fully vanished. It was simply carried on through diet rather than ritual. The folklore lingered, too. In some regions, cabbage leaves continue to be used as poultices for fevers and swelling well into the 18th and 19th centuries. Even in modern folk medicine, echoes survive. Cabbage compresses are still used today as home remedies for inflammation or breastfeeding discomfort. The idea that this humble plant holds hidden power refuses to die completely. And so, cabbage became a reminder continuity, a bridge between ancient belief and modern science, between superstition and nutrition. What was once considered a cure for nearly everything became recognized, at least, as a food that could sustain and strengthen. Perhaps that is its real legacy. In a world filled with uncertainty, where sickness struck without warning and cures were scarce, cabbage offered something dependable. People believed in it not because it always worked, but because it was always there, which leaves us a reflection. Was the healing power of cabbage ever in its leaves, or was it a human need to see hope and protection in the most ordinary of things? Imagine the sound of bells echoing through a medieval town square. The market stalls are busy. Children run between carts, and traders shout their prices. Suddenly, above the noise, a clearer, louder voice rises. "Hear ye, hear ye!" People stop, heads turn, and silence spreads through the crowd. A town crier has begun his work. Long before the printed press became common, the town crier was the living newspaper of the community. Appointed by local authorities, his job was simple yet crucial: to spread official announcements, proclamations, and laws to the people. In a world where most could not read, hearing the crier's voice was the only way to know the news. Criers often carried a handbell or a staff, tools that drew attention before they spoke. They positioned themselves in busy squares, crossroads, or in front of important buildings. When the bell rang, villagers and townsfolk gathered, not always willingly, but with curiosity. What followed might be news of a royal decree, a new market tax, or a punishment to be enforced. But criers announced more than just law. They spread word of births, deaths, lost animals, and public sales. A missing goat, a runaway servant, or the arrival of a foreign merchant could all be delivered by the booming voice of a single man. In many towns, criers also shouted the opening and closing of markets, helping regulate trade and daily rhythms. The role required more than lungs. A crier needed authority. He represented the crown, the town council, or the local lord. His word carried legal weight. If a proclamation was read aloud, It was considered known, whether or not every year caught it. Courts often treated crier announcements as binding. Ignorance was no excuse once the bell had rung, but the work was also dangerous. A crier might deliver news that angered the crowd, a rise in taxes, a harsh new law, or the announcement of executions. Records tell of criers being jeered, pelted with rotten food, or even attacked. Yet they were protected by law. To harm a town crier was to insult the authority he served, a crime punishable by fine or worse. What stands out most is how personal the role was. News was not words on a page, but a voice you recognized. A man who walked the same streets, who lived among you, but who also carried the power of distant rulers in his throat. The town crier was at once familiar and formidable, the bridge between the world of rulers and the world of common people. And so the question lingers. Did townsfolk listen to the crier with respect, with fear, or with quiet resentment at the voice that always reminded them of power from above? The town crier's work was not as simple as shouting words into the air. It was a profession that demanded strength, memory, and presence. A good crier was as much a performer as a messenger. Each day often began at the town hall or council chambers. There, the crier received scrolls or written orders from officials. Many criers could not read themselves, but they memorized the words as clerks read them aloud, repeating them until they could deliver the message verbatim. The responsibility was heavy. A misremembered line could change the meaning of a law, a trade regulation, or a sentence of punishment. Accuracy mattered. Armed with his bell, staff, or sometimes a drum, the crier set out through the streets. He stopped at prearranged points: the market square, the church steps, the crossroad by the gate. These were places where villagers naturally gathered, ensuring his words reached as many ears as possible. Bells rang, crowds hushed, and his voice carried over rooftops and cobblestones. The voice itself was a tool of the trade. Criers trained their lungs to project across distance, often developing a rhythm of pauses and emphasis, so that even half-distracted listeners could grasp the meaning. Some reports suggest criers used sing-song cadences, almost like chants, to keep attention. Others relied on stern authority, their tone carrying the weight of law, but their duties extended beyond proclamations. Many criers served as public announcers for hire. A merchant could pay a fee to have the crier advertise his wares. Families who lost valuables might ask the crier to shout a description through town. Even legal disputes sometimes played out in their voices. A crier might announce auctions of seized property, calling bidders to the square. Their role made them walking points of connection. Everyone knew the crier. He was a man whose voice marked the turning points of the day, from markets opening to curfews falling. In some towns, criers even led ceremonial processions, ringing bells during festivals or calling out prayers at funerals. Yet the role could be lonely. The crier stood at the center of attention, but not always in welcome. When news was grim, higher taxes, stricter laws, or the announcement of executions, crowds often turned on him. Jeers, rotten vegetables, or outright threats were not uncommon. To survive, criers needed resilience and a thick skin. Laws protected them, but laws did not silence angry mobs. The profession also carried a curious dignity. Though not noble or wealthy, criers held a unique authority. Their voices were law. To ignore a crier's proclamation was to ignore the crown or council itself. And so, ordinary men and women listened, whether with respect, resentment, or resignation. In this, the town crier became more than a messenger. He was a rhythm of daily life, a voice that cut through noise, marking the flow of power and community. But one question remains. Did people trust the words of the man with the bell, or did they simply listen because they knew they had no choice? By the 17th and 18th centuries, the world that had once belonged to the town crier began to change. Printing presses spread across Europe, and with them came broadsheets, pamphlets, and eventually newspapers. What had once required a strong voice in the market square could now be distributed as ink on paper. At first, criers and print coexisted. Many people still could not read, so announcements continued to be shouted aloud. In fact, criers sometimes read the contents of newspapers to gather crowds, serving as a bridge between written and oral worlds. But the tide was turning. Literacy spread, Printing became cheaper, and governments discovered that paper could travel further and last longer than human voice. The decline was uneven. In rural towns, criers remained essential well into the 19th century. In Britain, some were still announcing news in villages when railways were already crisscrossing the land. In France, criers continued to read official bulletins in public squares during the Revolution, their voices carrying the urgency of political change. Even in the United States, town criers lingered in some communities until newspapers and telegraphs fully took over. But eventually, the bell grew quiet. The modern age had less need for men who memorized proclamations and shouted them into the wind. Newspapers, telegraphs, radios, and televisions all replaced the profession one by one. Today, town criers survive mostly as ceremonial figures, appearing in parades or historical reenactments, dressed in flamboyant coats and tricorn hats, ringing bells for tradition rather than duty. And yet, their legacy remains woven into the fabric of public life. The idea that announcements should be heard by all, that news must be made public in a shared space, is as old as the crier's bell. In some ways, digital notifications and news alerts on our phones are the descendants of those shouts in the square. We no longer gather around a man with a bell, but we still wait for the voice of authority to break through the noise. The story of the town crier is a reminder of how communities once relied on a single voice to bind them together in knowledge. It also raises a reflection for us today. When everyone carries the news in their pocket, how we gained freedom, or how we lost a unifying moment of hearing it together in the square. Imagine the dirt road stretching before you. The village fades behind. Fields give way to forest paths, and the only sounds are the crunch of your boots and the call of distant birds. You carry little more than a staff, a pouch of bread, and a hope that you will reach the holy site where miracles are said to happen. This is pilgrimage, the medieval answer to both spiritual longing and, in its own way, travel. For centuries, pilgrimage was one of the most common forms of movement across Europe. Shrines dedicated to saints, relics, or holy events dotted the continent. The road to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, the route to Canterbury in England, the path to Rome, and of course the ultimate journey to Jerusalem, all drew waves of pilgrims year after year. Unlike merchants or soldiers, pilgrims traveled not for profit or conquest, but for penance, healing, or devotion. Some walked as punishment, sent by courts or confessors to atone for crimes or sins. Others went seeking cures for illnesses, believing that touching a saint's relic could bring relief. Many went simply because it was expected, a rite of passage, a demonstration of faith. Preparation was simple. A pilgrim's badge or token, often blessed by a priest, marked the journey as legitimate. These badges, stamped with symbols of the shrine, also offered a kind of protection. Fellow Christians were less likely to harm a man or woman, wearing the scallop shell of Santiago or the cross of Canterbury. The journey itself was grueling. Roads were rough, weather unpredictable, food uncertain. Pilgrims carried only the bare essentials: bread, cheese, perhaps a flask of wine. They slept in barns, roadside inns, or beneath the open sky. Along the way, they joined with others, forming loose bands that offered safety in numbers. A lone traveler risked robbers. A group of 20, chanting psalms as they walked, presented a more formidable sight. Silence was part of the rhythm. Pilgrims often walked in quiet reflection, repeating prayers, fingering rosaries, or simply letting the miles unfold beneath them. The road itself became a form of devotion, each step a small sacrifice. The act of walking was prayer made physical, yet there was also a social side. Roads to popular shrines were busy, filled with merchants catering to pilgrims, storytellers offering entertainment, and even pickpockets exploiting the crowds. Villages along the routes thrived on this constant flow of travelers, selling food, offering beds, and building chapels to attract weary souls. The paradox is clear. Pilgrimage was both deeply spiritual and profoundly ordinary. It was a journey of faith, but it was also one of blisters, hunger, and mud. It was devotion wrapped in the harshness of the road. And so we are left with the question: did medieval pilgrims experience these journeys as a burden to endure, or as a rare freedom, a chance to step away from daily toil and see the world in the name of God? A pilgrim's life was marked by repetition. Step after step, mile after mile. Yet the rhythm of the road was anything but dull. It was shaped by the constant balance of hardship and fellowship, danger and devotion. Days often began before dawn. Pilgrims rose stiff and cold, tightened the straps of their sandals, and set out while the sky was still gray. They carried little. A wooden staff to steady their stride, a pouch of bread and cheese, and perhaps a small flask of ale or wine. Wealthier pilgrims might pack animals or servants, but most walked with nothing but their own strength. Along the way, they relied on the hospitality of strangers. Inns and taverns catered to travelers, but many pilgrims slept in barns, churches, or roadside hostels established by religious orders. The Knights Hospitaller, for instance, built shelters across Europe to care for weary pilgrims. Monks along pilgrimage routes offered bread and broth in exchange for prayers. A peasant family might open their door out of piety, giving a stranger a place by the hearth for the night. But hospitality was never guaranteed. Pilgrims sometimes went hungry, sleeping in ditches or under hedges. Rain soaked their cloaks, winter winds cut through wool, and summer heat blistered feet. The journey demanded endurance as much as faith. The road also carried dangers. Bandits lurked in forests, waiting to ambush travelers. Wolves still roamed parts of Europe, adding to the fear of nighttime marches. Even dishonest innkeepers posed risks, overcharging or stealing from pilgrims too tired to resist. This is why many traveled in groups, singing hymns as they walked. The sound was both prayer and protection, warning predators that the road was not empty. Yet for all its risks, pilgrimage created a unique sense of community. Travelers from distant lands met along the road, sharing food, stories, and songs. A farmer from Normandy might walk beside a merchant from Flanders or a widow from Castile. Language barriers gave way to gestures, and faith bridged differences. These encounters often became the most memorable part of the journey. The faces and voices of fellow travelers, united in purpose, even if only for a few days. The experience was not without moments of joy. Pilgrims laughed, sang, and swapped tales by firelight. Markets along the routes buzzed with activity, selling charms, food, and tokens. Some towns even staged plays and festivals to entertain passing pilgrims, turning devotion into economy. For many, the journey was their first and only chance to see beyond their village, to glimpse cathedrals, mountains, or seas they might otherwise never have known. And through it all, silence remained. Hours of walking gave pilgrims time to reflect, pray, or simply drift in thought. The monotony of steps became its own rhythm, a heartbeat of faith on the road. Which leaves us with the question, did the hardships of the road strip pilgrimage of joy, or did they make reaching the shrine all the sweeter, the suffering itself part of the blessing? After weeks or months of walking, the final approach to a holy site was unlike any other. Pilgrims who had trudged through forests and mud suddenly found themselves in throngs of fellow travelers, banners waving, bells ringing, and the spires of a great cathedral rising on the horizon. Exhaustion gave way to anticipation. The road, once long and lonely, now ended in spectacle. At Santiago de Compostela, weary walkers entered the great square before the cathedral, some collapsing to their knees in tears. In Canterbury, pilgrims crowded the shrine of Thomas Becket, pressing tokens, cloth, or coins near the saint's relics in hope of blessing. In Rome, pilgrims kissed the worn feet of statues, knelt before altars, and joined in masses that echoed through vast basilicas. Relics were the heart of these destinations. A fragment of bone, a piece of cloth, a vial of oil or blood, these were believed to hold miraculous power. To touch, kiss, or even glimpse them was to draw nearer to God. Pilgrims brought home tokens, scallop shells, pewter badges, or small flasks of blessed water, proof that they had reached their goal. These souvenirs, pinned to hats or cloaks, marked a person not only as a traveler, but as one who had endured and returned transformed. But the end was not only about relics. For many, the journey itself had already worked its change. Weeks of hardship, silence, and fellowship etched themselves into memory. Bonds formed on the road often outlasted the trip. A farmer who met a merchant, a widow who prayed with strangers by firelight. Such encounters became stories told for a lifetime. Economically, pilgrimage left its mark on towns and villages. Inns, markets, and artisans thrived on the steady stream of travelers. Roads were maintained, chapels built, and entire communities reshaped by the presence of passing pilgrims. Faith may have fueled the movement, but commerce grew in its shadow. By the late Middle Ages, however, critics began to question the practice. Some mocked pilgrims as tourists chasing adventure more than salvation. Satirists wrote of rogues disguising themselves as pilgrims to beg or steal. The Protestant Reformation later condemned pilgrimage outright in many regions, attacking it as superstition. Yet the tradition never vanished entirely. Even today, routes like the Camino de Santiago draw thousands, walking not for relics but for reflection, fitness, or personal renewal. In the end, pilgrimage was both spiritual duty and human escape. It pulled peasants from their villages, nobles from their halls, and merchants from their shops, setting them on roads that stretched beyond their ordinary worlds. It was devotion made physical, but it was also travel, discovery, and freedom. And so the reflection lingers. Were medieval pilgrims truly seeking salvation, or were they also chasing something simpler? The rare chance to leave home, to walk under strange skies and feel for a time that the world was larger than their daily toil? Picture the ground beneath ancient feet. Dust, stone, mud, snow. Before fashion ever entered the picture, shoes were tools of survival. The earliest sandals, made of woven reeds or rawhide, appeared thousands of years ago. Simple and practical, they protected the skin without hiding the foot. Egyptians wore sandals of papyrus or palm fiber, their impressions still visible in tombs. Greeks and Romans refined them into leather creations with straps and nails, suited for marching armies in crowded streets. Shoes, in these early civilizations, were both practical and symbolic. Roman citizens wore different shoes to mark status. Senators with red straps, consuls with elaborate fastenings, soldiers with hobnailed soles that clattered on stone roads. To be barefoot was often a sign of poverty, servitude, or humility. Slaves worked without shoes. Pilgrims sometimes walked shoeless as a mark of penance. Kings and priests, meanwhile, displayed wealth in decorated sandals or boots. By the early Middle Ages, shoes became simpler again. Most were little more than leather slippers, stitched roughly and tied with laces or thongs. Durable boots protected travelers and soldiers, while peasants often wore shoes until they fell apart, or went without in summer months. Archaeological finds from muddy riverbanks in London reveal soft leather shoes worn thin by cobblestones, their seams patched and repatched. A shoe was not a luxury. It was a fragile shield against a harsh world. Yet even in this practical age, variation crept in. Monks often wore plain sandals, their simplicity reflecting vows of poverty. Nobles and kings favored sturdier boots lined with fur, especially in colder climates. The material of a shoe, rough hide, tan leather, or imported silk, immediately revealed one's rank. The act of shoemaking itself was a respected craft. Cobblers and cordwainers appeared in towns, their work essential but modest. Shoes were handmade, stitched to fit, and expensive enough that most people owned only a single pair at a time. Repair was constant. A cobbler's patch might keep a shoe alive for years. Still, shoes were more than protection. They carried meaning. To remove one's shoes in church or before a lord was a gesture of humility. To give shoes to the poor was an act of charity. To walk barefoot in public could be both shame and penance, a visible confession of guilt. And so, from ancient sandals to medieval slippers, shoes evolved not only to guard the foot, but to signal status, belief, and identity. Which raises a question. Were shoes in these early centuries seen more as shield against the earth, or as silent symbols of the wearer's place upon it? By the 12th and 13th centuries, shoes were no longer just tools of survival. They had become emblems of style and status. Nowhere was this clearer than the rise of the pointed shoe or pelaine. These shoes, with toes that stretched into long, curling points, first appeared in the courts of nobility. At their peak, the tips extended so far that wearers sometimes tied them to their knees with strings to keep from tripping. They were made of fine leather, silk, or velvet, sometimes embroidered with gold thread. To see a man walking in polaines was to know he was wealthy, fashionable, and proud. But what seemed stylish to the elite looked scandalous to others. Clergymen thundered against pointed shoes. calling them vain, sinful, and impractical. Preachers claimed that the devil himself could hide in the tips of such footwear. In some places, rulers even passed laws regulating shoe length, reserving the longest points for nobility and restricting commoners to shorter versions. Shoes, once humble, were now tangled in debates about morality and hierarchy. Meanwhile, ordinary people wore far plainer shoes. Farmers and townsfolk relied on sturdy leather boots or ankle-high shoes laced tight against mud and cold. Their soles were thick, often studded with iron nails for durability. Yet even here, hints of fashion appeared. Colored dyes, decorative stitching, or slashed leather to show off fabric beneath. For many, shoes became the only affordable way to display a touch of individuality. Shoemaking itself had grown into a specialized trade. Cobblers repaired worn pairs, while cordwainers crafted new ones from fresh leather. Guilds of shoemakers established rules of quality and training, ensuring that even common shoes had a certain standard. In larger towns, the smell of tanneries and workshops filled the air. The hidden cost of fashion was a stench of curing hides. The symbolism of shoes deepened. 2. In courtly culture, gifting shoes could be a mark of favor or affection. In law, the transfer of shoes was sometimes part of symbolic contracts, sealing agreements with a gesture older than parchment. In religion, removing shoes before holy places still carried the weight of humility and respect. Yet fashion always pushed forward. By the late 14th century, pointed shoes reached their most extreme forms, worn proudly by nobles despite ridicule and restriction. To walk in such shoes was to declare that one had no need for farm work, no concern for mud, no fear of ridicule. They were impractical, but that was the point. They existed to separate the privileged from the ordinary. And so the question rises, were pointed shoes a triumph of style over sense, or were they simply the visible tip of a much larger truth, that even the ground beneath our feet was shaped by class, power, and a desire to be seen? By the 15th century, the fashion for exaggerated points began to fade. Practicality crept back in, and shoes shortened into rounder shapes. But footwear never again returned to the purely humble role it had once played. From this point onward, shoes were not just coverings for the feet. They were statements of identity. In Renaissance courts, footwear became increasingly elaborate. Velvet slippers, embroidered with pearls or lined with fur, were worn indoors. Boots of fine leather, polished to a gleam, accompanied nobles on hunts or travels. In paintings, the shoes of rulers were as carefully detailed as their crowns. Shoes had become part of the language of power. For ordinary people, shoes remained precious but more varied than before. Guilds ensured affordable, durable designs spread to towns and villages. Repairs were constant. A single pair might last years, patched and resold many times. Still, the gap between noble silks and peasant leather was obvious at a glance. What you wore on your feet revealed your place in the world. Symbolism endured. In law, removing a shoe could still seal agreements. In folk custom, shoes carried luck. Thrown at weddings, placed in chimneys for protection, or buried under thresholds to bless a house. Even as fashion shifted, the shoe's role in ritual and superstition held fast, and technology marched forward. By the early modern period, shoemaking incorporated more structured soles, heels, and stitching techniques. The introduction of the heel, first practical for horse riding, then fashionable, changed posture and style forever. Men and women alike experimented with height, shape, and decoration, making footwear a playground of social display. Yet shoes also remained bound to survival. Soldiers' boots, crafted from marches and mud, determined how armies endured. Farmers' clogs and wooden pattens protected feet from fields and streets. The divide between fashion and necessity widened, but both sides told the same story. Shoes were never just leather and laces. They were tools, symbols, and markers of identity. Today, when we slip on sneakers, boots, or polished dress shoes, we inherit this long tradition. Our choices still signal wealth, work, or belonging. The runway heel and the steel-toed boot carry as much meaning as the noble plane, or the peasant clog once did. And so the reflection endures. Are shoes truly about walking, or have they always been about showing who we are every step of the way? Picture a great hall in Rome, Greece, or Persia. Torches flicker along painted walls. Music drifts from corner musicians, and guests recline on couches draped in fabric. Before them, stretched dishes of food, not just to fill the belly, but to impress the eye and flatter the host. The banquet was as much performance as nourishment. In ancient Greece, the symposium was famous not for its food, but for its drink. Meals were modest: bread, cheese, olives, figs, and roasted meats. But the real focus was wine, watered and spiced, consumed as conversation and philosophy flowed. Plato's Symposium reminds us that these gatherings were about ideas as much as appetites. Food opened the door. Drink and dialogue carried the night. In Rome, however, banquets became legendary for their extravagance. Wealthy Romans staged feasts that stretched for hours, filled with courses that reflected the empire's reach. Guests might begin with eggs and shellfish, followed by roasted boar, dormice stuffed with herbs, or exotic birds from Africa and Asia. Sauces made with fermented fish, garum, flavored nearly everything from meat to vegetables. Desserts included honey cakes, dates, and fruits imported from across the Mediterranean. Banquets in Persia and the Near East carried their own traditions of abundance. Royal courts served lamb, rice, fruits, and sweet pastries, perfumed with saffron or rosewater. Dishes were often paired with wine, music, and poetry. Like in Rome, food was inseparable from culture. To feed guests well was to demonstrate the wealth and order of the kingdom. But beneath the display lay a stark truth. These meals were not everyday fare. For ordinary people, daily diets were plain: porridge, bread, beans, and perhaps occasional fish or meat. The banquet existed to exaggerate difference, to show guests a vision of plenty that few could ever afford. To sit at such a table was to be reminded of one's place in a hierarchy, as much as to enjoy the taste of food. Banquets also carried ritual meaning. Certain foods symbolized fertility, strength, or prosperity. Toasts honored gods or ancestors. The very act of reclining while eating, something denied to slaves and the poor, signaled freedom and power. A Roman reclining on a couch, plucking grapes from a platter, was not merely eating. He was performing his status. Yet for all the richness, feasts were not without criticism. Philosophers mocked excess, warning that indulgence led to weakness. Satirists described guests vomiting between courses so they could continue eating. Even within societies that prized banquets, the line between refinement and gluttony was often debated. And so we return to the banquet table, piled high with delicacies and humming with conversation. For those who reclined there, the feast was a window into empire and identity. But the question lingers. Did guests taste joy in every bite, or did they sense that behind the glittering platters lay hunger in the homes of those who could never join the feast? If the first course of the banquet established plenty, the later courses aimed to astonish. Hosts competed not just to feed, but to dazzle. The menu was a stage, and every dish a performance. In Rome, the wealthy prided themselves on serving animals few had ever tasted. Records describe peacocks roasted with feathers reattached to shimmer on the table, cranes stewed in spices, and flamingo tongues prized as delicacies. Whole pigs were sometimes brought in with bellies stuffed full of smaller animals, so that carving them revealed new dishes hidden within. Apicius, the Roman gourmet whose recipe survived, advised sauces of honey, vinegar, and garum poured over everything from boar to vegetables. The banquet was less about satisfying hunger than showcasing mastery of abundance. Entertainment mingled with food. Dancers, musicians, jugglers, and even gladiators sometimes appeared between courses. Guests reclined, nibbling grapes while acrobats leapt or poets recited verses. Food was not a pause in the evening. It was woven into a spectacle of wealth, culture, and control. In Greek symposia, excess was less about exotic foods and more about wine and wit. Drinking contests, philosophical debates, and riddles unfolded as cups were passed. Food might be simple: roasted lamb, olives, figs, but the performance lay in conversation. To eat sparingly but speak brilliantly was considered refined. To gorge was considered base. In the Persian courts, banquets blended luxury with ceremony. Platters of lamb, chicken, rice, and fruit were scented with saffron, cinnamon, and rosewater. Silver trays gleamed with pomegranates and melons. Guests were seated in strict order rank, each dish reinforcing hierarchy. Musicians played, poets recited, and every bite was as much ritual as pleasure. For ordinary guests, the experience was overwhelming. A farmer or minor official invited to such a table might find dishes utterly foreign, meats spiced with ingredients from distant lands, fruits he had never seen, or sweets dripping with honey far beyond daily reach. To eat at such a table was to taste the empire itself, each dish a reminder of its reach and its riches. But beneath the glitter of excess lay a practical truth. Much of the food was preserved. Salted fish, dried fruits, and pickled vegetables ensured supply across seasons. Honey acted as both sweetener and preservative. Even the richest banquets relied on the same logic as the poorest households, keeping food safe against scarcity. Satirists of the age did not let these spectacles pass unchallenged. Writers like Juvenal mocked nobles who devour flamingo tongues, while the poor lived on bread and porridge. The banquet was always double-edged, a sign of greatness to some, a symbol of greed to others. And so, the sight of tables groaning under peacocks and honeyed dormice leaves us with a question. Were banquets truly about pleasure, or were they a carefully staged illusion of power, meant to remind guests who ruled both the land and the stomach? As torches burned low and servants cleared the last platters, the true impact of ancient banquets became clear. Guests, full to the point of discomfort, often lingered in conversation or games. Some banquets ended with drunken singing, others with philosophical debate, still others in sheer excess. Roman accounts describe guests excusing themselves to vomit so they could return for more food, a practice that horrified moralists and became a symbol of decadent gluttony. Satirists like Seneca and Juvenal use a banquet table as a metaphor for greed, arguing that empires fell not by swords but by indulgence. To them, flamingo tongues and stuffed dormice were less meals than moral failures. And yet, these same feasts carried cultural weight. Banquets forged alliances, honored victories, and reinforced hierarchies. To be invited to a noble's table was to be recognized. To be seated close to the host was to be favored. Food was politics in edible form. The aftermath of the banquet stretched beyond the hall. Servants carted leftovers to kitchens. Scraps sometimes fed the poor, though just as often wasted. Dishes and cups were washed. Musicians paid, and the memory of spectacle lingered in gossip and poetry. For days, towns buzzed with talk of what was served, who attended, and how lavishly it all unfolded. The contrast between banquet and daily life was stark. Ordinary Romans and Greeks ate barley porridge, lentils, bread, and the occasional fish. Persians in villages relied on rice, onions, and herbs. To read of noble tables groaning with exotic meats was, for most, like hearing of another world. The banquet was a reminder of distance between rich and poor, ruler and ruled. And yet, the legacy endures. Today's state dinners, royal banquets, and elaborate weddings carry the same function: to impress, to unite, to project wealth and order. Even the foods chosen, rare wines, imported fruits, artful desserts, echo the ancient pattern of using the plate as a stage. So we end where we began, a hall lit by fire, voices rising, dishes gleaming. Guests ate, laughed, debated, and judged. But beneath it all was a question that haunted every feast. Was a banquet a gift of hospitality, or a performance of power meant to remind the hungry world who held abundance in their hands? Imagine standing in a field in the 13th century. You have no barometer, no forecast, no almanac. Yet your entire livelihood depends on knowing when to sow, when to harvest, and when storms might strike. For medieval people, predicting the weather was not a luxury. It was survival. The first tool was the most obvious: the sky itself. Farmers watched the color of dawn and dusk, believing a red sky in the morning warned rain, while a red sky at night promised fair weather, a proverb that still lingers today. Cloud shapes were studied closely. Tall, rising clouds signaled storms. Thin, wispy streaks promised calm. Even the way smoke rose from chimneys could be read. Straight upward meant fair skies, while drifting low meant damp air and coming rain. Animal behavior was another guide. Swallows flying low were thought to signal storms, since insects dropped closer to the ground in heavy air. Frogs croaking loudly meant rain was near. Cows lying down in fields, sheep huddling together, dogs rolling on the ground. All were taken as omens of shifts in the weather. These signs mixed observation with superstition, blending truth with tradition. The moon and stars carried their own messages. A halo around the moon was believed to foretell rain or snow. Bright, twinkling stars suggested wind. Farmers timed planting and harvesting by lunar cycles, convinced that crops thrive better when sown under certain phases of the moon. But weather prediction was not only practical, it was spiritual. The church calendar linked certain feast days with expected weather. St. Swithin's Day in England carried a legend that if it rained on July 15th, it would rain for 40 days after. St. Medard in France was said to govern rain. St. Urban was invoked for protection of vineyards. These traditions gave people anchors in a world of uncertainty, turning the chaos of weather into something tied to saints and rituals. Manuscripts of the time included lists of weather sayings, mixing practical advice with superstition. Monks recorded that thunder in February meant a poor harvest, while lightning in winter foretold a plague. Fishermen swore that certain winds carried good catches, while sailors read the color of the sea as a guide to storms. And while much of it was guesswork, there was wisdom hidden in the repetition. Generations of observation built patterns, and those patterns carried enough truth to endure. A farmer who trusted the sky was not always right, but he was often right enough to survive, which leaves us with a lingering thought. Did medieval people truly believe the saints controlled the rain, or did they simply need stories to give shape to a sky they could never fully understand? By the later Middle Ages, attempts to predict weather grew more systematic. Observation alone was not enough. People sought patterns written in the heavens. Astrology played a central role. Scholars believed the positions of planets and stars influenced not only human fate, but also winds, rains, and harvests. Monks and university-trained clerics drew elaborate charts, linking storms to eclipses, droughts to planetary alignments. A conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter might be blamed for harsh winters. A lunar eclipse could foreshadow floods. These predictions carried authority because they came from men versed in Latin and learning, even if the accuracy was often no better than a farmer's proverb. The rise of almanacs spread these ideas widely. Cheaply copied and circulated, these little booklets provided calendars filled with saints' days, moon phases, and weather signs. A farmer might consult his almanac before sowing, noting that if March comes in like a lion, it will go out like a lamb, or that rain on certain feast days foretold a poor harvest. These sayings blended astronomy, tradition, and folklore into a guide that gave structure to the chaos of the skies. Churchmen also tied weather to morality. Droughts, floods, and storms were often preached as punishments for sin. A storm destroying crops was not merely nature's whim, but God's warning to repent. In this way, weather prediction became moral interpretation. Priests did not simply forecast rain. They explained why it came. For many peasants, the sermon after a storm was as important as the storm itself. At the same time, practical observation persisted. Fishermen on coasts knew the look of waves before a gale. Shepherds noticed how sheep shifted on hills before storms. Monastic chroniclers meticulously recorded unusual weather, noting years of hard frosts, endless rains, or blazing droughts. These records, kept over centuries, became some of our best sources for medieval climate history. Yet the lines between truth and superstition blurred. If a rooster crowed at night, some swore rain was coming. If swarms of insects filled the air, plague as well as storms might follow. The authority of astrology mixed with the weight of folklore, creating a world where science and superstition coexisted comfortably. The reliance on heavenly signs reveals a profound truth. Medieval people saw the sky not as an empty space of clouds and stars, but as a book written by God, waiting to be read. To study the heavens was not curiosity alone, it was devotion. Still, we must ask, were medieval weather predictions an early step towards science, or were they simply another way to soothe the fear of living at the mercy of skies that no one could truly command? For all the sayings, charts, and signs, medieval weather predictions were fragile things. When they failed, the consequences could be devastating. A farmer who planted too early on the promise of a mild spring might lose his entire crop to frost. A fisherman who trusted a superstition about calm seas could be swept away by sudden storms. A priest who declared that drought was ending because of the saint's day might face anger when the rain refused to come. In a world where survival depended on food, failed predictions were not simply disappointments. They were disasters. Famines often followed years of misjudged weather. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for instance, brought relentless rain across northern Europe. Crops rotted, livestock died, and entire villages starved. Chroniclers noted strange omens in the sky, but could do little to explain or prepare. Faith and predictions faltered, but the hunger remained. People sought scapegoats, witches, sinners, even entire communities accused of angering God. Weather, unpredictable and unyielding, became a stage for fear as well as faith. Yet even in failure, these systems endured. Why? Because they gave structure to uncertainty. A farmer who said, "Red sky at night, shepherd's delight," was not always right, but he had a way to make sense of the horizon. A monk who linked floods to eclipses could not stop the waters, but he offered meaning in chaos. To predict, however poorly, was to resist helplessness. Over time, these traditions laid a foundation for science. The careful records of chroniclers, frosts, floods, storms, and droughts became data for later climatologists. The folk sayings that survived often held kernels of truth, rooted in generations of observation. Even astrology, for all its errors, kept people looking upward, attentive to cycles that science would later explain. The legacy lingers in our language. We still say red sky at night, and March comes in like a lion. Farmers' almanacs, filled with weather lore, remain popular centuries after their medieval counterparts. We still want to believe the skies can be read, that nature leaves us clues, if only we are wise enough to see them. And so, the final reflection stands. Were medieval weather predictions foolish superstition? Or were they the first, faltering steps in humanity's long attempt to wrestle order from the wild and ungovernable sky? Imagine a stone-walled room inside a monastery, lit dimly by flickering candles. The air smells of parchment, animal skin scraped smooth, and of ink made from oak galls and soot. At a long wooden desk sits a scribe, hunched over, quill in hand. Hours stretch into days, days into weeks, as he scratches letters onto the page. This was the life of a scribe, slow, repetitive, and often mind-numbingly dull. Before the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, every book had to be copied by hand. Monks and monasteries were the chief guardians of this task. Their job was to preserve religious texts, classical works, legal documents, and chronicles. Without them, much of the ancient world's knowledge would have vanished. Yet for the scribes themselves, the work was rarely glamorous. A single manuscript could take months or years to complete. Each sheet of parchment required careful preparation, stretched, scraped, and cut smooth. The scribe dipped his quill into ink again and again, writing with painstaking precision. A slip of the hand, a blot of ink, or a misspelled word could ruin a page that had taken hours to prepare. The work was physically taxing. Hours of sitting bent forward, strained back, neck and eyes. Candlelight flickered, making letters hard to see. In winter, fingers grew numb from cold. In summer, sweat smudged the ink. Some scribes left notes in the margins of books they copied, complaining about their aching hands, the dim light, or their hunger. One weary scribe scrawled, "Oh, my hand." Another sighed, "This parchment is hairy." These little voices remind us that behind every text stood a tired human being. Yet precision mattered. Religious texts demanded accuracy. A single error in a psalm or gospel could carry theological consequences. Monasteries developed systems of checking. One monk copied, another reviewed, and sometimes a third corrected. Margins filled with notes, symbols, and corrections, showing invisible teamwork behind a finished manuscript. The rhythm of the scribe's day matched the bells of the monastery. Hours of prayer punctuated hours of copying. Work stopped for meals, resumed until dusk, then ended when light failed. Each day felt the same, quill scratching parchment, one line after another, until the book slowly grew, page by page. And yet, for all its dullness, the scribe's work carried immense weight. Every copied book was a bridge between generations, ensuring that knowledge survived wars, fires, and time itself. To the scribe, it may have felt like boredom. To us, it looks like devotion. Still, the thought lingers. Did the scribe find comfort in his repetitive task, or did he dream of escape from the endless prison of ink and parchment? Copying books by hand was meant to be mechanical, one word after another, nothing more. But scribes were human, and their humanity leaked into the pages in unexpected ways. Mistakes were inevitable. A tired scribe might skip a line, repeat a phrase, or smudge ink across the parchment. Some errors were caught and corrected. Others lived on forever, silently carried forward in every later copy. Scholars today can trace families of manuscripts by following these mistakes, each one a fingerprint of fatigue left by a nameless hand centuries ago. Margins tell an even richer story. While the main text marched on in careful script, the edges often carried scribes' private voices. Notes like "this is hard work," or "the end of the book is near, thank God," appear in medieval manuscripts. Others joke with doodles, tiny faces, animals, or even caricatures of fellow monks. What was supposed to be solemn preservation sometimes became a canvas for boredom and humor. At the same time, manuscripts carried moments of beauty. Illuminators, often separate from the scribes, filled initials with gold leaf, painted saints in vivid blues and reds, and surrounded texts with vines, animals, and fantastical creatures. Even ordinary scribes added flourishes to their letters, turning simple words into art. For a book that might take years to complete, the embellishment was both devotion and pride. But artistry came at a price. Mistakes in decoration could not be erased. Gold leaf cracked, paint flaked, and ink bled through parchment. The pressure to balance precision with beauty weighed heavily. For every shimmering page of illuminated glory, there were countless plain volumes, copied word for word with no color at all, their beauty lying only in their survival. The pace of the work was relentless. A fast scribe might manage 3 or 4 pages a day, but most moved slower. To complete a Bible could take years of labor, shared by teams of scribes working in shifts. Monasteries poured resources into this work, treating it as both spiritual duty and a way to preserve influence. Books were treasures, chained to lecterns or locked in armories, valued as much as gold. For the scribes themselves, pride mingled with weariness. Their notes remind us that they knew the significance of their work, even as they longed for it to end. One wrote simply, "Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink." And so, through their slips, doodles, and sighs, scribes left behind more than copied words. They left fragments of themselves, tucked between lines of holy texts and histories. Which leaves us with a question. Were scribes truly invisible servants of knowledge, or do the little quirks in their work reveal that every book they copied carried a hidden shadow of their personality? By the mid-15th century, the life of the scribe faced a revolution. When Johannes Gutenberg perfected the printing press, the centuries-old rhythm of quill and parchment was shaken forever. What had once taken months or years could now be produced in days. Books multiplied faster than scribes could imagine, and a profession that had preserved knowledge for generations began to fade. For some scribes, the change was devastating. Their painstaking work, once the backbone of culture, suddenly seemed obsolete. Monasteries reduced their scriptoria. Universities ordered printed books instead of hand-copied ones. Within a few decades, the steady scratching of quills that filled cloisters for centuries grew silent. And yet, scribes did not vanish overnight. Some continued to copy luxury manuscripts for nobles who prized the artistry of handwritten books. Illuminated Bibles, prayer books, and charters remained symbols of wealth and devotion. Even as print spread, the human touch of a scribe's hand carried prestige. But slowly, inevitably, mass production replaced the monk's steady pen. Looking back, it is easy to see scribes as mere machines, men and women chained to desks, repeating words like echoes. Yet their legacy is profound. Without them, countless works of antiquity would have been lost. Homer's epics, Aristotle's treatises, the Bible itself. Every medieval library, every fragment of ancient wisdom we still read, exists because someone hunched in candlelight and copied it line by line. Their boredom was our salvation. Their aching hands ensured that knowledge did not vanish in war, fire, or neglect. Even their mistakes gave future generations clues about how texts traveled, shifted, and survived. The marginal doodles of a bored monk are now treasures for historians, proof that behind the sacred page lived ordinary men with humor, frustration, and humanity. The printing press ended the scribe's age, but not their importance. They remind us that history is not only shaped by kings and battles, but by anonymous laborers who copied words until their eyes blurred. The survival of civilization often depends less on glory than on patience. And so the reflection remains. Were scribes prisoners of monotony, or were they quiet heroes whose very boredom became the foundation of our memory? Step to the doors of a medieval kitchen, and you are hit by heat and smoke. Fires roar in great hearths. Spits creak as they turn heavy cuts of meat, and pots bubble with stews thick enough to feed dozens. The air is thick with the scent of onions, garlic, and wood smoke, but also the sweat of the servants who make it all happen. The kitchen was one of the busiest spaces in any great household. In castles, it could rival the size of a hall, with multiple fires burning at once. In monasteries, it was a heart of daily life, feeding monks and lay brothers in endless cycles. Even in smaller manors, kitchens demanded constant work, for food was not only sustenance but a symbol of wealth, power, and order. The chores began before dawn. Fires had to be lit and maintained all day, often with wood hauled from outside. Bread ovens were heated hours before baking began. Meat needed to be salted or spiced, fish cleaned, vegetables peeled and chopped. Water had to be fetched from wells, sometimes carried in heavy buckets for long distances. Nothing was convenient. Every task was laborious. Servants worked in teams. Some tended the spits, turning them slowly by hand for hours to ensure even roasting. Others stirred vast cauldrons with paddles taller than themselves. Scullions scrubbed pots blackened by soot, often with sand or ashes, scraping until their hands were raw. The youngest boys ran errands, fetching herbs from gardens, carrying trays, or running messages between kitchen and hall. Cleanliness was constant battle. Smoke clung to every surface. Fat from roasting meat dripped onto floors. Rats and flies prowled the edges of kitchens, drawn by scraps and spills. Servants had to sweep, scrub, and chase pests while still keeping the fires burning and the food moving. And yet, for all its drudgery, the kitchen was also a place of importance. The meals it produced defined a household's reputation. A lord who offered lavish feasts earned respect. A monastery known for thin or tasteless meals risked complaints from its brethren. Every onion chopped, every loaf baked, every spit turned was part of maintaining status and honor. For the servants themselves, however, it was endless toil. Few remembered their names, though their labor fed everyone from knights to monks. Their world was heat, smoke, and orders shouted across crowded rooms, which leaves us with the reflection. Did those who worked in the medieval kitchen see themselves as invisible laborers, or did they take pride in knowing that without their hands, even the mightiest lord would go hungry? A medieval kitchen was not chaos, though it might have looked that way. Behind the smoke and bustle was a structure as strict as any battlefield. Every servant knew their place, and survival of both the household and the workers themselves depended on it. At the top stood the master cook, or head of the kitchens. In castles and noble houses, this was a respected position, often filled by someone with years of experience. The cook directed what meals were served, supervised purchases of meat and grain, and oversaw the timing of feasts. He answered directly to the steward or lord, making the kitchen one of the most closely monitored spaces in the estate. Beneath him, ranks divided tasks. Spit boys, often young boys or lower servants, turned the roasting spits for hours, sometimes all day, sweating in front of the fire until their faces were blackened with soot. Scullions were at the very bottom, tasked with the filthiest jobs, scrubbing greasy pans, hauling water, clearing scraps, and chasing rats. Many records describe scullions as half-starved and constantly exhausted, their lives short and harsh. Pastry cooks specialized in pies and breads, kneading dough and managing ovens. Butchers and fishmongers worked nearby, breaking down carcasses or cleaning fish before they ever reached the fire. Sauciers or sauce makers prepared the endless array of gravies, broths, and spice mixtures that medieval cuisine loved. Each role required skill, but also discipline. In a kitchen feeding hundreds, as in large monasteries or during noble feasts, timing was everything. Meat had to be roasted while bread baked, fish salted, and wine prepared. A single delay could throw an entire banquet into chaos. The sound of the kitchen told its story. Spits creaking, knives chopping, cauldrons bubbling, servants shouting instructions. The smells shifted through the day, from fresh bread in the morning to roasting meat by afternoon to acrid smoke lingering at night. For those inside, it was a world of constant sensory assault. It was also a place of learning. Young servants often began in kitchens, moving up if they proved reliable. A boy who started turning spits might one day become a cook, earning both respect and slightly better conditions. Skills in butchering, baking, or brewing could even transfer beyond the household, giving former servant opportunities in towns or markets. Still, most never rose far. The majority lived and died in smoke-filled kitchens, their names forgotten even as their labor fed generations. And yet, without them, no banquet, no feast, no daily bread would have reached the tables above. So we are left to ask, was a medieval kitchen a place of opportunity, or was it simply a furnace that burned through lives in service of other people's appetites?